Imagine being accused of a crime in medieval Europe, standing before a judge who hands you a red-hot iron bar and says, "If you're innocent, God will protect you from the flames." This wasn't fiction. This was justice in the Dark Ages. For over 1,000 years, medieval courts relied on trial by ordeal, a barbaric legal system that subjected accused individuals to torture, believing that divine intervention would reveal the truth. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most twisted forms of justice, where boiling water, scorching metal, and deadly poisons determined guilt or innocence. The concept of trial by ordeal emerged from the collision of primitive Germanic tribal customs and early Christian theology. In the chaotic world following the fall of the Roman Empire, traditional legal systems crumbled, leaving behind a void that desperate societies filled with supernatural beliefs and ritualized violence. The collapse of Roman administrative structures left medieval Europe without the sophisticated legal frameworks that had maintained order for centuries. Local strongmen, petty kings, and tribal chieftains struggled to establish legitimate authority while dealing with constant warfare, plague, and economic collapse. In this environment of uncertainty and violence, supernatural justice offered both practical solutions and psychological comfort to traumatized populations. Germanic tribes had long practiced forms of trial by combat and ordeal, viewing them as direct appeals to their gods for justice. These practices were deeply rooted in warrior cultures that valued strength, courage, and divine favor above intellectual reasoning or evidence-based judgment. The gods of Germanic mythology were seen as active participants in human affairs, warriors themselves who would naturally support the righteous in battle or trial. When Christianity spread throughout Europe, rather than abandoning these practices, church leaders adapted them, transforming pagan rituals into supposedly Christian ceremonies. This syncretism wasn't accidental, but represented a deliberate strategy by early missionaries who recognized that complete replacement of existing customs would meet insurmountable resistance. Instead, they grafted Christian theology onto pagan practices, creating hybrid systems that satisfied both religious requirements and cultural expectations. The logic was simple yet horrifying. Since God was omniscient and omnipotent, He would intervene to protect the innocent during these brutal tests. This theological framework provided perfect justification for continuing practices that might otherwise have been recognized as barbaric torture. Church fathers like Augustine and later Aquinas developed sophisticated arguments explaining why God would choose to reveal truth through physical suffering, rather than through human reasoning or investigation. By the 8th century, trial by ordeal had become deeply embedded in Frankish law under Charlemagne's reign. The Carolingian Empire systematized these practices, creating detailed procedures that would persist for centuries. Legal codes like the Lex Alimanorum and Lex Baiuvariorum specified exactly how ordeals should be conducted, what prayers should be recited, and how results should be interpreted. What began as desperate attempts to maintain order in lawless times evolved into institutionalized torture sanctioned by both church and state. The theological justification grew more sophisticated over time. Medieval scholars argued that ordeal trials represented a form of prayer, a direct communication with the divine that bypassed human fallibility. They believed that earthly judges were too corrupt or ignorant to discern truth, but God would never allow the innocent to suffer unjustly. This belief system created a perfect storm of religious fanaticism and judicial cruelty. The intellectual framework supporting ordeals drew heavily from biblical precedents, particularly Old Testament stories, where God intervened directly in human affairs to establish justice. Medieval theologians pointed to accounts like Daniel in the lion's den or the 3 Hebrew children in Nebuchadnezzar's furnace as proof that God would protect the innocent from physical harm. They conveniently ignored the many biblical passages emphasizing human responsibility for establishing justice and the importance of careful investigation and multiple witnesses in legal proceedings. The most infamous form of trial by ordeal involved red-hot iron, a test that subjected accused individuals to excruciating agony while crowds watched for signs of divine intervention. The process began with elaborate religious ceremonies designed to sanctify the proceedings and ensure God's attention. The preparation phase was deliberately designed to maximize psychological torture while maintaining the pretense of religious solemnity. Churches would be specially prepared for ordeal ceremonies, with altars cleared of normal religious objects and replaced with the implements of torture. Iron bars, tongs, and heating braziers would be blessed with holy water and incense, while priests chanted prayers calling upon divine judgment. Priests would celebrate Mass in the church where the ordeal would take place, blessing the iron implements and calling upon divine judgment. The accused was required to fast for 3 days beforehand, attending daily services and receiving communion to purify their soul for the ultimate test. This preparation period served dual purposes. It heightened the psychological torture, while supposedly ensuring that the participant was spiritually ready to receive God's verdict. The fasting requirement was particularly cruel, as it weakened the accused both physically and mentally while they contemplated their approaching ordeal. Deprived of food and subjected to constant religious ceremonies focused on divine punishment, many victims experienced severe anxiety, hallucinations, and psychological breakdown before the actual trial even began. Church authorities interpreted these symptoms as evidence of guilt, creating a vicious cycle where fear itself became proof of wrongdoing. On the day of the ordeal, the iron bar was heated in a fire blessed by holy water and sacred oils. The temperature had to reach a specific level of red-hot intensity, hot enough to cause immediate blistering and severe burns. Court officials would test the iron's readiness by sprinkling water on its surface, looking for the characteristic hiss and steam that indicated proper heating. The heating process itself became a form of torture, as the accused was forced to watch the instrument of their torment being prepared while listening to prayers about divine justice and eternal damnation. The actual iron used varied according to local customs and the severity of the accusation. Minor crimes might require carrying a 1-pound iron bar, while serious offenses demanded 3-pound implements that were nearly impossible to grip securely. Some regions used specially shaped irons with raised surfaces or sharp edges, designed to maximize tissue damage and create more dramatic scarring that could be easily evaluated later. The accused was then required to carry this blazing metal for a predetermined distance, typically 9 feet, representing the number of steps Christ took carrying the cross. Some variations required the person to walk across red-hot plowshares or carry heated stones. The iron would sear through skin instantly, causing third-degree burns that penetrated deep into muscle tissue. The smell of burning flesh would fill the church, while spectators watched for signs of divine protection. The psychological impact on witnesses was profound and intentional. Children were often required to attend these ceremonies as part of their moral education, learning early that divine justice was both terrible and absolute. The traumatic memories of watching neighbors tortured in God's name would shape their behavior for life, creating populations that lived in constant fear of accusations and divine wrath. After completing the walk, the accused's hand was immediately wrapped in blessed cloth and sealed with the judge's ring. This bandage would remain untouched for 3 days, while the community waited for divine judgment to manifest. The logic was both simple and sadistic. If God intended to prove the person's innocence, the burns would heal miraculously without infection or scarring. The 3-day waiting period was deliberately chosen to maximize suspense while allowing time for infection to develop in guilty parties. Trial by boiling water presented another horrific option for determining guilt or innocence, one that medieval authorities considered more merciful than red-hot iron because it supposedly caused less permanent damage. This assessment reveals the twisted moral calculus of medieval justice, where degrees of torture were carefully calibrated and justified. The procedure began with heating a cauldron of water to a violent boil, often in the church courtyard, where the entire community could witness the proceedings. Priests blessed the water while reciting prayers and calling upon God to reveal the truth through the coming ordeal. The religious ceremony surrounding the boiling water trial was particularly elaborate, as authorities believed that more extensive blessing would ensure more reliable divine intervention. The accused was required to plunge their bare arm into the scalding water to retrieve a stone or ring placed at the bottom of the cauldron. The depth varied according to the severity of the accusation. Minor crimes required reaching only to the wrist, while serious offenses demanded complete submersion to the elbow. This gradation system demonstrates how medieval minds attempted to create proportional justice within fundamentally irrational proceedings. The immediate effects were devastating. Boiling water causes instant tissue damage, destroying skin cells and creating massive blisters filled with fluid. Victims would emerge from the cauldron with their flesh literally cooking, the heat continuing to penetrate deeper layers of tissue even after removal from the water. The agony was indescribable, yet the ordeal was far from over. Like the iron trial, the boiled limb was bandaged and sealed for 3 days of waiting. During this period, infection was almost inevitable. Medieval understanding of hygiene was primitive at best, and the combination of massive tissue damage with unsanitary conditions created perfect breeding grounds for deadly bacteria. Many victims died from sepsis long before their supposed divine judgment could be evaluated. While fire and boiling water tormented the accused with searing heat, cold water ordeals operated on the opposite principle, using the element's supposed purity to reject guilty individuals. This form of trial became particularly associated with accusations of witchcraft and heresy, creating a legal paradox that guaranteed conviction regardless of outcome. The cold water ordeal involved binding the accused's hands and feet, then lowering them into blessed water, typically a pond or river that had been sanctified through extensive religious ceremonies. The theory held that pure water, having been blessed by God, would naturally reject evil individuals, causing them to float on the surface like oil. Innocent people, being acceptable to the divine element, would sink naturally. This created an impossible situation for the accused. Sinking proved innocence, but likely resulted in drowning, while floating demonstrated guilt and led to immediate execution. The only hope lay in somehow achieving the perfect balance of sinking just enough to prove innocence while avoiding death by drowning, a nearly impossible feat when bound hand and foot. The preparation for cold water ordeals was extensive and psychologically devastating. Accused individuals were stripped naked and examined for any objects or markings that might affect their buoyancy. This public humiliation served as additional punishment while supposedly ensuring the trial's accuracy. Women accused of witchcraft faced particular degradation as crowds gathered to witness their shame and search for supposed signs of demonic influence. The binding process itself was ritualistic and cruel. Ropes were tied in specific patterns believed to have religious significance, with the left thumb bound to the right toe and vice versa. This position made any coordinated movement impossible while creating maximum discomfort and panic once submerged. The bound victim was then lowered slowly into the water while priests chanted prayers and the crowd watched for signs of divine judgment. Trial by combat represented perhaps the most overtly violent form of medieval ordeal, transforming courtrooms into battlefields where might literally made right. This practice emerged from Germanic warrior traditions but became deeply embedded in medieval legal systems across Europe, creating a judicial framework that favored the strong and ruthless over the just. The concept was deceptively simple. Opposing parties would fight to the death, or until one yielded, with victory interpreted as divine vindication of the winner's position. God, being just and omnipotent, would naturally strengthen the innocent party and weaken the guilty. This belief system allowed medieval societies to outsource moral judgment to brute force while maintaining the fiction of divine justice. The legal framework surrounding trial by combat was surprisingly sophisticated, revealing how thoroughly medieval minds had rationalized institutionalized violence. Different social classes had specific combat rules. Nobles fought on horseback with full armor and weapons of their choice, while peasants battled on foot with simple clubs or agricultural implements. The wealthy could hire professional champions, creating a class of mercenary fighters who specialized in judicial combat and often determined legal outcomes based on their skill with weapons rather than the merit of their clients' cases. Combat trials were governed by elaborate rules that attempted to ensure fairness while maintaining the ceremony's sacred character. Fighters had to be matched according to social status, age, and physical condition. Women, children, elderly individuals, and clergy could appoint champions to fight on their behalf, creating a class of professional warriors who specialized in judicial combat. These champions developed sophisticated techniques and accumulated vast experience in legal fighting, making them nearly unbeatable against ordinary citizens who found themselves suddenly thrust into mortal combat. The preparation for trial by combat was extensive and ritualistic. Participants fasted and prayed for days before the encounter, receiving communion and swearing sacred oaths regarding their cause's righteousness. The combat ground was blessed by priests and surrounded by religious symbols designed to invoke divine presence and ensure accurate judgment. Lists were constructed according to specific measurements, with barriers to contain the violence and platforms for judges and spectators. Weapons were carefully inspected and blessed before combat, with priests calling upon God to guide the blades toward justice. Armor was similarly sanctified, though the effectiveness of divine protection was often undermined by the superior equipment that wealth could purchase. The ceremony included elaborate oaths where each combatant swore before God that their cause was just, calling down divine punishment upon themselves if they fought falsely. The fights themselves were brutal affairs that often resulted in death or permanent disability. Medieval weapons were designed for maximum damage, and the combatants fought with desperate intensity, knowing that defeat meant not just death, but eternal damnation as a proven liar. Battles could last for hours, with fighters continuing despite severe injuries, driven by terror of the spiritual consequences of surrender. Spectators would cheer for their preferred champion, while priests watched for signs of divine intervention. Victory conditions varied according to local custom and the nature of the dispute. Some combats required death to determine the winner, while others allowed surrender when one party was clearly defeated. The moment of victory was often interpreted as the precise instant when God revealed his judgment, with priests immediately declaring the winner divinely vindicated and the loser condemned not just in law, but in the eyes of heaven. The aftermath of judicial combat was often as brutal as the fighting itself. Defeated parties who survived were typically executed anyway, since their defeat proved their guilt in the original accusation. Families of the condemned could be stripped of property and exiled, extending the punishment beyond the actual combatants. Champions who lost might face disgrace and loss of livelihood, while successful fighters could build reputations and wealth through their skill at legal violence. Among the more unusual forms of trial by ordeal was the korsned, or trial by blessed bread, which relied on the accused's ability to swallow and digest sanctified food as proof of innocence. This practice was particularly common in Anglo-Saxon England and reveals the medieval mind's ability to find supernatural significance in the most mundane human functions. The korsned involved preparing a special piece of bread, typically weighing about an ounce, that had been blessed with extensive prayers and holy water. The accused was required to eat this bread while standing before the altar, with the entire community watching for signs of divine judgment. The theory held that guilty individuals would be unable to swallow the sacred food, as God would cause it to stick in their throats or make them choke. This ordeal exploited basic human physiology in particularly cruel ways. Fear and stress naturally inhibit saliva production and cause throat muscles to constrict, making swallowing difficult under normal circumstances. When combined with the terror of facing potential execution, and the psychological pressure of community scrutiny, many innocent people found themselves unable to consume the blessed bread, thereby proving their guilt. The religious ceremony surrounding the courson was elaborate and psychologically devastating. Priests would spend hours blessing the bread while reciting prayers about divine judgment and eternal punishment. The accused was forced to participate in these ceremonies, listening to detailed descriptions of the torments awaiting the guilty while contemplating their upcoming ordeal. The bread itself was often prepared in ways that made swallowing more difficult. Some varieties included coarse grains or were deliberately overbaked to create a dry, crumbly texture. Others were blessed with oils or herbs that created an unpleasant taste or texture designed to trigger the gag reflex. These modifications were justified as ways of ensuring that God's judgment would be clearly manifest. In some regions, trial by ordeal escalated to outright poisoning, with accused individuals forced to consume toxic substances while authorities watched for signs of divine protection. These practices reveal the medieval legal system's willingness to embrace almost certain death as a means of determining guilt or innocence. The most common poison ordeal involved consuming extracts from the calabar bean, a highly toxic plant that causes severe neurological symptoms including muscle spasms, respiratory paralysis, and death. The accused was given a measured dose based on their body weight, with the understanding that innocent individuals would somehow survive or recover from the poisoning through divine intervention. Other toxic substances used in medieval poison trials included extracts from various mushrooms, heavy metals like mercury or lead, and concoctions made from poisonous plants. The preparation of these substances was ritualized and conducted by priests or other religious authorities who blessed the poisons while praying for accurate divine judgment. The effects of these poison ordeals were horrific to witness. Victims would experience rapid onset of symptoms including violent nausea, convulsions, hallucinations, and eventual organ failure. The crowds that gathered to watch these trials were witnessing slow, agonizing deaths, disguised as divine justice. Survival was virtually impossible without immediate medical intervention, which was both unavailable and considered interference with God's will. The few individuals who somehow survived poison ordeals were typically left with permanent neurological damage, organ failure, or other serious health problems that plagued them for the remainder of their shortened lives. The persistence of trial by ordeal for over a millennium reveals disturbing truths about medieval psychology and the human capacity for rationalized cruelty. These practices weren't simply primitive barbarity, but represented sophisticated systems of social control that served multiple functions within medieval society. Fear was the primary tool of medieval justice, and ordeals maximized this effect through elaborate public ceremonies that traumatized entire communities. The knowledge that anyone could be subjected to these brutal tests created a climate of terror that discouraged dissent, rebellion, or any behavior that might attract unwanted attention from authorities. The religious framework surrounding ordeals provided psychological cover for participants, allowing judges, priests, and spectators to participate in torture while maintaining their moral self-image. By framing brutality as divine will, medieval authorities could inflict incredible suffering while believing themselves to be instruments of justice rather than agents of cruelty. Community participation was crucial to the ordeal system's effectiveness. These weren't private proceedings, but public spectacles that required entire populations to witness and validate the supposed divine judgments. This collective participation spread responsibility for the outcomes while reinforcing social hierarchies and religious authority. The ordeal system also provided a mechanism for eliminating undesirable individuals while maintaining the fiction of fair trials. Unpopular community members, political opponents, economic rivals, or anyone who threatened existing power structures could be subjected to ordeals with predetermined outcomes, allowing authorities to remove threats while claiming divine sanction for their actions. The decline of trial by ordeal was gradual and uneven, occurring over several centuries as changing intellectual, religious, and political currents gradually undermined the theological foundations that had sustained these practices. The process reveals how deeply embedded these brutal customs had become in medieval legal and social systems. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 marked a crucial turning point when Pope Innocent III formally prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals. This papal decree didn't immediately end the practices, but removed their official religious sanction, forcing secular authorities to find alternative justifications for continued use. The Pope's decision was influenced by growing theological sophistication and increasing discomfort with the Church's role in sanctioning torture, but it also reflected political calculations about papal authority and the need to centralize religious control. The papal prohibition created immediate practical problems for medieval courts that had relied on ordeal for centuries. Without priestly blessing and supervision, the entire theological framework supporting these practices began to crumble. Some regions attempted to continue ordeals with secular ceremonies, but these lacked the religious authority that had made the trials psychologically compelling for medieval populations. The rise of scholastic theology in the 12th and 13th centuries provided intellectual frameworks that challenged ordeal theology. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas argued that demanding miraculous intervention in routine legal proceedings was presumptuous and potentially blasphemous, suggesting that God worked through natural law rather than constant supernatural intervention. These arguments gained influence in university circles and gradually filtered down to educated clergy and secular administrators. Aquinas and other scholastic thinkers developed sophisticated critiques of ordeal theology, arguing that such practices represented a form of tempting God that was forbidden in Scripture. They pointed to Christ's rejection of Satan's challenge to throw himself from the temple, interpreting this as divine disapproval of deliberately seeking miraculous intervention. These theological arguments provided intellectual ammunition for critics of the ordeal system while offering alternative approaches to justice based on reason and investigation. Economic and political changes also contributed to ordeal's decline. The growth of towns and trade created more complex legal disputes that required sophisticated evidence evaluation rather than divine revelation. Commercial contracts, property rights, and mercantile regulations demanded careful analysis of documents and testimony rather than supernatural judgment. Royal courts, seeking to centralize authority, found ordeals unpredictable and began favoring procedures that gave judges more control over outcomes. The revival of Roman law in medieval universities provided alternative legal frameworks that emphasized investigation, evidence, and rational analysis over supernatural intervention. Legal scholars trained in Roman jurisprudence found ordeal trials primitive and unreliable, preferring systems based on testimony, documentation, and logical reasoning. These alternative approaches gradually gained acceptance among educated elites, while filtering down to local courts. The development of more sophisticated legal procedures also played a crucial role in ordeal's decline. The emergence of professional judges, court clerks, and legal advocates created institutional structures that could handle complex cases without resorting to supernatural judgment. These professionals had vested interests in promoting rational legal procedures that demonstrated their expertise and value. However, the transition away from ordeals was neither quick nor complete. Many regions continued practicing various forms of supernatural judgment well into the Renaissance period, particularly in cases involving witchcraft or heresy. Rural areas were especially resistant to change, clinging to traditional practices long after urban centers had adopted more rational procedures. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, employed methods that bore striking similarities to medieval ordeals, demonstrating the persistence of these brutal approaches to justice.